Victorian London, 1891. 3 years after Jack the Ripper's reign of terror. For the capital's prostitutes, life is beginning to return to normal. And there is a chilling occurrence. A working girl, Ellen Donworth, dies on the streets of Lambeth. Is Jack back, or is a new killer preying on the ladies of the night?
London in the 1890s was a teeming, heaving city of gaslight and fogs. The men dressed in tall silk hats, the women in bustles and bows.
But for those who were poor like Ellen, life was hard. Houses were overcrowded and disease was rife. It would be easy to understand why she turned to a life on the streets.
The economic was going to be great. They could earn 7, 10, 12 times as much a year as they'd previously done as a domestic servant or as a factory worker or whatever.
Many of these unfortunates, as they were known, lived south of the river.
Lambeth was so notorious by the end of the 19th century that Waterloo was jokingly referred to as Hortaloo.
Lambeth's prostitutes plied their trade with the hundreds of musical goers and commuters who passed through the area.
In the 1890s there was something like 10 or 12 theatres and musicals packed into Waterloo.
And there was no shortage of clients.
With Waterloo Station just over there, the cut there, Lower Marsh Street Market behind us, it would have been teeming with people. And in the evening, when the market would have still been open, there would have been crowds and crowds and crowds circulating.
But behind the fun and frolics, there was a darker side to life.
You just have to turn down a side street off of these sort of busy, well-lighted main thoroughfares to go back into the kind of poverty warrens where people like Ellen Donworth would have lived.
Women like Ellen may have been attracted by the money, but they had chosen a dangerous lifestyle.
The life of the average prostitute in Lambeth, or anywhere else for that matter, in the 1890s was generally nasty, brutish and short.
Unwanted pregnancies, backstreet abortions and alcoholism were just some of the risks they faced.
It's not really surprising that huge numbers of prostitutes finally ended up by committing suicide.
With few brothels in London, women carried out their business in their own homes or out on the streets. They were easy prey for unsavory characters.
Any client who picked up any one of these women could potentially have been Jack the Ripper, could certainly potentially be some sort of killer.
In 1891, Ellen Donworth was just 19. She had given up her job labelling bottles and had started work as a prostitute. She lived just off Stamford Street.
This is the actual street where Ellen Donworth lived. We know that she was renting a room off a landlady. There were other people in other rooms. That's all she could have afforded.
On the 13th of October, Ellen received a note from a stranger, a man called Fred. He asked to meet her at the York Hotel on Waterloo Road. She hoped he would become a regular client.
He was dressed in the style of what the Victorians called a nut. That's a K-N-U-T, a rather dashing silk-lined cloak, a gold-top cane, a very tall silk hat.
He was a passably attractive man, so therefore she would have thought she was in the presence of some very grand person and been very impressed.
But Ellen's trust in this man was badly misplaced. This cost her her life. At around 7 that evening, she said goodbye to Fred and left the pub. These were to be some of her last ever steps. Within minutes, she was finding it difficult to walk and was suffering from excruciating pains. She was found by a friend who thought she was drunk, but she was suffering from something much more sinister.
She was put to bed and she was gripped by terrible convulsions. The poor girl took all night to die.
Ellen managed to tell her landlady that she had drunk twice from a bottle of pale liquid. It had been given to her by the man she had gone to meet, the mysterious Fred. She was taken to hospital but died in the street on the way there. A post-mortem revealed that her stomach contained large quantities of strychnine.
If somebody wanted to inflict a very malicious type of death on somebody, they'd think of strychnine, I think. It will cause convulsions within about 10 to 15 to 20 minutes, and they get worse and worse as the blood levels increase. It's a really painful death.
I think it's almost unimaginable. It's so horrible.
Her death shocked the prostitute community of Lambeth.
It was a very local affair. Her body was found round the corner near Waterloo Station. She was brought back here. She was screaming in agony through the night. Obviously, everyone in the street would have known about it, and eventually, of course, everyone in Lambeth knew about it once it hit the papers.
And these women had every cause for concern.
The killer, whoever he was, got some kind of amazing buzz out of it and couldn't wait to do it again.
Fred was seen with another woman just a week later.
Her name was Louisa Harvey, or Lou Harvey. She met this odd man opposite Charing Cross Underground Station.
That night they went to a pub for a drink, and after that walked down to the embankment where this man pressed her to take 2 long white pills which he'd produced from his waistcoat pocket. They were wrapped in tissue paper. When the man was satisfied that Lou Harvey had indeed swallowed the pills and followed them up with the figs, he suddenly, out of the blue, cancelled their plans to go on to the music hall, which was the arrangement, turned on his heel and walked off into the darkness.
What then happened to this young prostitute was a complete mystery.
Louisa Harvey, to all intents and purposes, vanished.
6 months later, there was still no sign of her, but she was not to be Fred's last victim. 2 girls living in Stamford Street, Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivell, befell a similar fate.
This area, Stamford Street and Waterloo Road Junction, was known as Misery Junction.
In April 1892, they had a dinner of tinned salmon at their home in Misery Junction with a man they had recently met.
In a room, an upstairs room like this, one of them was found foaming at the mouth, standing at the bedroom door, and her companion lying groaning on the bed.
Both women died agonizing deaths that night, and once again, the cause was strychnine. When asked why they had taken pills from a stranger, one said he was no stranger, he was a doctor.
The public have always had trust for doctors. These girls were prostitutes, so they would have been more compliant and agreeable to keep their clients happy, I think.
After their deaths, an intriguing development took place.
A Dr. Joseph Harper of Barnstaple in Devon received a blackmail letter. It was signed by someone calling himself Murray, who claimed to have proof that Dr. Harper's son, who was a medical student, had poisoned Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivell.
Dr. Harper, like any other parent, would have felt absolutely horrified at having his son accused of murder.
Dr. Harper's son, Walter, did work in Lambeth. So could he have been the culprit?
Well, he must have found himself in a horrible predicament because he had been accused of murder, and therefore he was expected to put up some kind of defence against the accusation.
He clearly would have had access as a young medical intern to the strychnine, which was the method of poisoning Shrivell and Marsh. But in fact, there was really no evidence, apart from the allegation made boldly in the letter, to suggest that Dr. Harper Jr. had in fact had any involvement with the women or had any responsibility for their death.
The blackmailer accused Walter Harper of poisoning the 2 women, but the letter was sent before their post-mortems. So who had written these letters?
The blackmailer had to be someone who had inside knowledge.
Murray, whoever he was, the writer of the letter to Dr. Harper, could even have been the killer.
A number of blackmailing letters were sent in connection with the murders. The most puzzling mentioned another young prostitute, Matilda Clover.
They knew she was a prostitute, they knew she was dead, but they thought that she died of drink. They had not suspected murder. Her death had gone unreported in the papers. So how did this mysterious blackmailing letter writer know that she'd been killed and furthermore had been poisoned?
The police thought that it was just the work of a lunatic, and therefore they discounted that letter completely when they received it.
With 3 girls dead and the murderer still prowling the streets of London, the police were under pressure to catch the killer. But they had a number of questions still to answer. Were the poisoner and blackmailer one and the same? Had Matilda Clover really died of alcoholism? And who and where was Lou? In the spring of 1890, there was still a dark cloud hanging over Lambeth. 3 prostitutes had been horribly poisoned, and one had disappeared without trace. The killer was still on the loose, and the clock was ticking for Scotland Yard to track him down.
The detectives of the day would have clamped a bowler hat over their ears and put on a heavy overcoat and stomped off, making door-to-door inquiries.
Using these methods, there was a breakthrough. The police found a major suspect. A tall, dark man called William Slater was not only found in possession of strychnine, but had been seen in Ellen's company around the time of her death. The police thought they had found the killer.
In fact, it was a dead end, and Slater was, in fact, charged with an entirely unrelated murder.
On the 16th of April, a local newspaper reported that a man called Clifton had been seen with the Stamford Street girls on the night of their deaths. The police frantically searched for more evidence, but luck was against them.
There was nothing else to actually link him with their death, apart from that fact that he had been with them.
The hunt for the killer had caught the public's imagination. People all over London tried to crack the case themselves. John Haynes, a former detective, was desperate to get a job with Scotland Yard. He teamed up with Thomas Neill, a doctor who lived in Lambeth. Between them, they had a wealth of information, and it was their discussions that would eventually lead to a major breakthrough.
We became quite pally and went to the pubs together and chatted up the case. Obviously, Haynes had a professional interest in, and this man Neill said he was a doctor, so therefore he obviously shared interest in this poisoning matter.
But then Neill started divulging information that was just too good to be true. He knew more about the murders than Haynes, and far more than Scotland Yard.
Neill talked a lot to Haynes about the Lambeth poisonings as they now become known in the press, and even went to the extent of giving Haynes a guided tour of some of the murder sites. That seemed an extraordinary thing to do to Haynes, who became increasingly suspicious by the day.
Neill told Haynes that he knew the 3 women, Lou Harvey, Matilda Clover, Ellen Donworth, who had been murdered the previous autumn. At that time, it was not known that Matilda Clover had been poisoned. And as far as Lou Harvey was concerned, there was absolutely no evidence at all that she was dead.
Well, this aroused Haynes' suspicion, being a detective or an ex-detective, because he wondered how Neill knew about these matters.
At first, Haynes wasn't sure about Neill. Was he a fantasist, or was he harbouring a sinister secret?
As time went on, Haynes did become more concerned that what he was being given was not false information, but information with at least an essential factual basis to it.
Although slightly perturbed, Haynes saw a way of furthering his career. He went to Scotland Yard. They were very interested in what he told them.
What the authorities did know was that the blackmailer, whoever he was, had mentioned these women by name in the course of his extortionist letters. So the thought at this stage was perhaps that they were on to the trail, not necessarily of the murderer, but at least on the trail of the blackmailer.
In late April, house-to-house inquiries in Matilda Clover's neighbourhood proved crucial to the investigation.
They found someone living with her who described Matilda Clover's last symptoms, and they certainly matched up in terms of what they knew about the deaths of Ellen Donworth, Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivell.
On the basis of this information, the police investigation picked up pace. It seemed they had another murder on their hands. Matilda Clover's body was exhumed on the 6th of May, 1892. 14 corpses had to be taken out of the pauper's grave before her body could be removed, and interestingly, it was remarkably well preserved.
The pathologist who examined Matilda Clover's body was very thorough. It took him 3 weeks, and in that time he was grinding up pieces of tissue until he had a paste, and then he could apply tests to the liquid that he produced. Clearly he found most of the poison in her stomach contents. After tasting it to find that it was bitter, he administered some of it to a frog, and it had typical strychnine convulsions and died.
I think the exhumation was a crucial part of the police investigation, because once they exhumed the body and established that Matilda Clover had died through strychnine poisoning, then certain parts of the jigsaw began to fall into place.
The blackmailer knew about Matilda's poisoning, and so did Thomas Neill. So could they be one and the same? The police interviewed Dr. Harper and found that the blackmail letter he had received matched Neill's handwriting. This was the hard evidence they'd been looking for, and Neill was arrested for blackmail on the 3rd of June. Then, interesting news came from abroad.
The authorities got word from Canada as to the real identity of the man that they knew as Thomas Neill. In fact, he was Thomas Neill Cream. He'd decapitated his name, if that's the right expression, shortened it certainly to Thomas Neill.
With his identity revealed, the true nature of Cream's character became apparent. Across the Atlantic, he was known as an abortionist, blackmailer, and convicted murderer. With this new information, the police were sure Cream was involved in the 4 murders and the strange disappearance of Lou Harvey. Time was against them, but more interviews with Matilda's friends proved crucial to the investigation.
Eyewitnesses soon thereafter came forward and identified Dr. Neill as a person they had seen with Matilda Clover back in October 92, shortly before her death.
Matilda Clover's inquest took place in court on the 22nd of June, and Cream was now on trial for murder.
The procedure was slightly different in 1892 in that it was open to a jury in those days not only to find the cause of death, but to actually name the person who had, in fact, unlawfully caused that death.
Things were already looking bad for Cream, but they were about to get worse in what was one of the most extraordinary incidents in legal history.
There was a sensational development when a surprise witness came forward, none other than Louisa Harvey, or Lou Harvey, who'd read her own name in the newspaper in the course of the evidence.
And there she was in the witness box, giving a detailed account implicating him in the clearest possible way in an attempt to murder her.
Lou Harvey's real name was Louisa Harris. She had been suspicious of this man, Fred, and had concealed her true identity. She described how she'd pretended to take pills from the man in the courtroom, but had thrown them on the ground at the last minute. This single act had surely saved her life.
Well, as you can imagine, he was completely stunned.
He almost couldn't believe his eyes. He'd been sitting quietly, but then looked at this woman, took his glasses off, literally rubbed his eyes, as if to say, I just cannot believe what I'm seeing here.
It was quite obvious at that point, if anybody had been at the court, that guilt was written all over his face, because he knew that she was alive when he thought she was dead.
On the 13th of July, the jury found that Matilda Clover had died of strychnine poisoning, and that the strychnine had been administered by Cream with the intent to murder. As well as the blackmail letters, Cream was eventually charged with the murders of Clover, Donworth, Marsh, and Shrivell, and the attempted murder of Lou Harvey.
I think it had a particular dramatic tension because the defendant was, on the face of it, a respectable professional man, and the victims were prostitutes who in those days were considered as utterly degenerate. But when it became apparent that the case against him was overwhelming, I think public opinion swung totally against him. And in a way, the fact that he was a middle-class professional compounded in people's minds the evil of what he'd done and the evil of who he was.
The trial took place at the Old Bailey in October 1892, and the jury took just 10 minutes to find Cream guilty.
In Victorian times, I think the juries were out for very much shorter times than they are in most criminal trials today, but even by their standards, to return verdicts of guilty on all of those counts within 10 minutes must have been close to a record, particularly as the jury, of course, knew that the inevitable consequence.
Cream was hanged on the 15th of November 1892, but incredibly, he could have escaped prosecution altogether.
You do have this extraordinary situation in which he really convicted himself.
Unfortunately, he committed blunder after blunder and was an absolute egomaniac who thought that everything he did was right and he couldn't fail, and had enormous self-confidence and had a lust for murder.
But Cream had one last secret.
His last words were, "I am Jack thee." And then he went to his maker.
So was he Jack the Ripper?
Most people believe that he was in jail in 1888 during the Ripper murders. But I have reason to believe that he was not in jail and that he bribed his way out.
I think it's a great stretch of the imagination to imagine that someone like Cream could have organised things in such a way.
If one accepts that his last words before the noose tightened were, "I'm Jack the," it's always open to speculation that what he intended to say was, "I'm Jack the lad," and not Jack the Ripper.
But Cream is more than just a Ripper suspect. He has his own place in history as one of London's most prolific serial killers.
Cream was convicted and hung and has been forgotten. The Ripper was never found and has never been forgotten.
Well, next week at the same time, we look at the latest clues in our bid to identify the real Jack the Ripper and uncover some surprising facts. Another London Scary Mystery for you next Friday at 11:35. Next tonight, first qualifying for Austria 2003.